The history of the Second World War is filled with tragedies and acts of courage. Volumes of memoirs have been written, hundreds of films have been made, thousands of memorials have been raised. Yet among the millions of heroic names, there is one that, for decades, was not spoken aloud in the very country for which a man gave everything he had. That name is Alexander Aronovich Pechersky. He was the man who dared to lead an uprising in the Sobibor death camp, freed hundreds of prisoners, and then became an unwelcome hero to his own state. Today, Pechersky's deed is known around the world. His name is heard in halls of remembrance, in documentaries, and in books about the Holocaust. Yet 30 or 40 years ago, only a few knew this story, and mostly outside the Soviet Union. Why did that happen? Why did a man who carried out perhaps the only successful mass revolt in a Nazi death camp remain half forgotten, without awards and without official recognition? To understand this, we must return to the middle of the 20th century. Step by step, we must reconstruct the chain of events. We must compare it with documents declassified only in the 1990s. We must try to answer the central question: how the memory of a hero was locked away for decades. Alexander Pechersky was born on February 22, 1909, in Kremenchuk, Poltava province. He came from an ordinary Jewish family. His childhood was unremarkable. The family moved to Rostov-on-Don, where he studied and became passionate about theater and music. He could not know that a little more than 30 years later, he would find himself in one of the most terrible places on earth and would lead people condemned to die. But before that, there was war. In the summer of 1941, he was drafted into the Red Army. In October of the same year, he was encircled near Vyazma, and together with thousands of Soviet soldiers, taken prisoner. For most prisoners of war, this meant a slow death from hunger, disease, or a bullet. For Jews, as Pechersky was, the sentence was harsher still. They were sent to special camps where selection for death took place without trial or record. 2 years later, in September 1943, after drifting through several camps, he arrived at Sobibor in occupied Poland, one of 3 death camps created under the Nazi Operation Reinhard. The camp had a single purpose: the complete annihilation of Jews deported from across Europe. Prisoners arrived in trains. Those who could work were kept. The rest were sent straight to the gas chambers. Pechersky was placed among the temporary workers. For 6 weeks, he saw death every day. There he conceived a plan that seemed mad, almost unreal: to spark an uprising and give people a chance at life. That uprising, on October 14, 1943, entered history as the only successful mass escape from a death camp. Yet after the war, it was scarcely mentioned. In the Soviet Union, Pechersky's fate became an inconvenient subject. He was a former prisoner of war, and the country often treated POWs as potential traitors. Documents show that Pechersky spent years trying to tell the story of the revolt. He wrote articles. He gave interviews to foreign journalists. Inside the country, his story remained half forbidden. Only decades later, when archives were declassified and independent historians began to publish their research, did the truth about the uprising become accessible to the wider public. This investigative series is an attempt to trace Alexander Pechersky's path from an ordinary Soviet officer to the leader of the most audacious uprising in the history of the death camps. We will examine how he arrived at Sobibor, how the escape plan was born, what happened on October 14th, and how the hero's fate changed after the war. But before speaking about the uprising itself, we must return to his childhood, his youth, and the war. Step by step, we will follow the life of a man who was destined to challenge the machinery of death. Pre-war years. To understand what kind of man Alexander Pechersky had become by the time of his great mission, it is important to reconstruct his life before the war. The years that came before captivity, the years he rarely spoke of. For many years, historians gathered fragments of memories from his relatives, friends, and fellow soldiers, searched archives and old documents, trying to form a complete portrait of this man. Alexander Aronovich Pechersky was born on February 22, 1909, in Kremenchuk, Poltava province of the Russian Empire. His father, Aron Pechersky, worked as an accountant in a small trading shop, and his mother, Rivka, managed the household. The family lived modestly, but not in poverty. The children were educated, and their home was filled with respect for learning and art. In 1914, when Alexander was 5 years old, the family moved to Rostov-on-Don. They sought better work and more opportunities for their children. At that time, Rostov was a major trading city, a place where Jewish families could feel a little freer than in the provincial towns of Poltava. Alexander's childhood fell upon the turbulent years of revolutions and civil war. He was 8 when the empire collapsed and fighting for power began. Contemporaries described a city where chaos, hunger, and bandit raids coexisted with hope for a new life. These events hardened the boy, taught him independence, and gave him the habit of making quick decisions. Learning came easily to Pechersky. In the late 1920s, he finished school and entered Rostov University to study law. After a year, he switched to technical courses, while also attending a drama studio. There, his talent for acting appeared. His love for the stage, his ability to influence people through words. Later, in the camp, these qualities would help him become the leader whom hundreds of doomed prisoners would follow. In the early 1930s, Alexander Pechersky began working as a technician at one of Rostov's factories. He lived an ordinary life of a Soviet citizen. Work, occasional theater visits, meetings with friends. Those were the years when repression spread rapidly and fear filled the air. But Alexander stayed away from politics and avoided the blows of the system. His personal life developed gradually. In 1934, he met Olga Gurevich, a music teacher. A year later they married, and soon their daughter Elena was born. Friends recalled him as a devoted father who could spend hours with his child, reading, telling stories about travels and adventures. Yet the 1930s were uneasy years. The Soviet Union lived in expectation of a great war, and militarization advanced quickly. In 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland, Pechersky, like thousands of other young men, was called up for military training. It was then that he first put on a uniform and realized that soon he would have to fight not for ideals, but for life itself. The last peaceful year of his life was 1940. It was a brief time of calm. Alexander spent much of it with his family, wrote notes for the factory newspaper, and took part in amateur theater. He believed that ahead lay a quiet life, work, family, and the upbringing of his daughter, even in difficult times. But on June 22, 1941, everything changed. The Great Patriotic War began, and the life of Alexander Pechersky was forever divided into before and after. Within weeks, he was mobilized and sent to the front. The peaceful biography of an engineer and theater enthusiast ended. The biography of a soldier began, a road that would lead him into the heart of hell. War and captivity. On June 22, 1941, the roar of artillery and aircraft awakened the Soviet Union. Germany had begun a massive invasion, breaking the non-aggression pact, and within days, the front ran red with blood, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Alexander Pechersky, then an engineer in Rostov-on-Don, received his call-up notice within the first weeks of the war. He was drafted into the Red Army in late July 1941 and assigned to a rifle regiment that was still being formed in the rear. Training lasted only a short time. There was no time at all, as the front retreated eastward. Young recruits, most without combat experience, were sent into battle almost unprepared. That autumn was catastrophic for the Red Army. German forces carried out vast encirclements, creating the so-called pockets, where hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers perished or were captured. In early October, near the city of Vyazma, Pechersky and his division were caught in one of these traps. The fighting lasted several days. Communication with command was lost, ammunition ran out, and by October 12th, most of the Soviet troops had been captured. Alexander was among tens of thousands of prisoners forced to march westward. The death marches were horrific. Hunger, cold, beatings, executions of those who collapsed from exhaustion. Even then, it was clear that German captivity meant not just imprisonment, but a death sentence. During the winter of 1941, he was transferred to a prisoner of war camp near Smolensk. Meals consisted of a single ladle of rotten turnip soup per day. There was no shelter, and many died of typhus and cold. Alexander survived only by miracle, helping the wounded, encouraging others, keeping their spirit alive. It was during this time that he became a natural leader, the man who could lift even the hopeless back to their feet. In early 1942, the Germans began selecting prisoners of Jewish origin. Their fate was even worse: execution or transfer to special camps for the unwanted. Pechersky tried to hide his background, but in August of that year, a medical examination exposed him. He was separated from the others and sent first to a camp in Mogilev, then to Minsk, where he spent nearly a year working in a repair workshop. Testimonies tell that in Minsk he was already thinking of escape. Witnesses later recalled that he attempted to organize a breakout in the spring of 1943. But the plan collapsed after a betrayal by one of the prisoners. After that, the Germans transferred him to an even worse place, a transit camp from which Jews were shipped to death camps in occupied Poland. In September 1943, Pechersky and several hundred others were transported by train to Sobibor, a camp built solely for the extermination of Jews under Operation Reinhard. The journey lasted several days, in cattle cars with no food or water. Many died before reaching the destination. Those who survived arrived at a place where life was measured in days, sometimes hours. Alexander was among the few selected for temporary labor: carpentry, shoemaking, and maintenance work. He did not yet know that this would be the place where he would challenge the entire machine of death. Captivity changed Pechersky. The peaceful engineer and amateur actor had become a man ready to risk his life for others. In the camp, his stubborn character, his ability to persuade, and his calmness in the face of terror revealed themselves fully. Only a month after arriving in Sobibor, these qualities would ignite preparations for the most daring uprising ever attempted in a Nazi death camp. The first days and birth of the plan. On September 14th, 1943, a narrow freight car packed with people stopped at a small station deep in the Polish forests. Exhausted prisoners were driven out under blows and barking orders. Before them loomed rows of barbed wire, watchtowers, dogs, and gray barracks. Alexander Pechersky saw for the first time the place that would become part of history: the Sobibor death camp. From the first minutes, it was clear. This was no ordinary camp for prisoners of war. New arrivals were divided, men to one side, women and children to another. The latter were led toward a concrete building with pipes on the roof. Some already understood the terrible truth. No one left this place alive. The camp existed for one purpose only: extermination. Pechersky was assigned to the group of labor Jews. They were forced to maintain the camp, sort clothing, repair equipment, and build structures. The Germans fed them barely enough to survive. Anyone who weakened was sent to the gas chambers. Witnesses later said that at first Pechersky seemed stunned, but soon regained control. He observed, listened, analyzed, as if knowing he must find a way out of hell. It was in these first days that the idea of rebellion began to form. Life in the camp was a chain of daily horrors. Mornings began with roll calls and beatings. Prisoners worked under the eyes of SS guards and Ukrainian auxiliaries. The stench of burning flesh hung constantly over the camp. People disappeared nightly. No one asked where. Everyone knew the answer. Pechersky met other inmates, some who had already endured multiple camps, who had seen mass killings and torture. Among them was Leon Feldhendler, who had once tried to organize an escape but failed. The guards were too many, the gates locked, the forests around mined and patrolled. Still, Alexander was different. He had military training, composure, and an authority others quickly recognized. Within days, he voiced an idea that sounded insane. Not just to run, but to kill the guards, seize weapons, and lead a mass escape. For weeks, he studied every detail of camp life, the guards' routines, weapon storage, train schedules. Every small observation could mean survival. He knew a direct assault would fail, but deception might work, if they could lure the SS officers into traps. Every move meant death if discovered. Dozens had tried to flee before and were executed. Their corpses were left on display as warnings. Yet that very terror made rebellion seem the only choice. By late September, Pechersky had formed a small trusted circle: soldiers, craftsmen, men who could move around the camp unnoticed. The plan was suicidal. Lure officers one by one into workshops, kill them quietly, take their weapons, and in the chaos, storm the gate. Plans were whispered at night in barracks. One careless word could doom them. Informers traded lives for bread. Still, hope spread. Pechersky told them, "We are all dead already. Only those who fight will die as humans." Those words became legend. By early October, the plan was still rough: few weapons, little time. But Pechersky's eyes burned with the fire that no hunger or fear could quench. Sobibor was destined to become the stage for the boldest revolt against the Nazi machine of death. And there, among barracks and crematoria, in mid-September, an idea was born that would change history. Preparation for the uprising. Steps toward the unthinkable. The first days of October, 1943 passed in Sobibor, under the usual shadow of horror and death. New transports arrived almost daily. Women and children went straight to the gas chambers. Men were selected for labor, a temporary reprieve before their own turn came. Alexander Pechersky, already respected among the prisoners, knew they had to act fast before the Germans sent him to the crematorium. In early October, he called a secret meeting of trusted men. Among them were Leon Feldhendler, former head of the camp's underground, and several Red Army soldiers who knew weapons and tactics. That night, as rain drummed on the barracks roof, Pechersky spoke. "We are all doomed, but there is only one way to die as men: to rise." Those words became their oath. The greatest problem was weapons. The camp held about 20 SS men and over 40 Ukrainian guards armed with rifles and submachine guns. The prisoners had only hammers, knives, and axes hidden in workshops. Pechersky understood. To win, they had to seize the Germans' guns. The plan was to lure officers, one by one, into workshops under pretexts, to fit boots, repair uniforms, or inspect goods, and kill them silently. The first rehearsal took place on October 5th. 2 prisoners managed to draw a guard into the cobbler's shop. They held hammers, pretending to fix shoes. But the guard grew suspicious, pulled his pistol, and shouted. The plan collapsed. Fortunately, no one was exposed. The Germans decided he had panicked. Still, it proved how one mistake could lead to mass executions. Pechersky refined the plan. He enforced strict secrecy, whispers only, meetings no larger than 2 men, and each participant responsible for one task. A network of observers tracked the guards' routines, who visited which workshops, at what time, and with whom. On October 10th came word of a new transport. Among the arrivals were former Red Army soldiers and partisans, hardened men who strengthened the core of the revolt. Their presence gave hope. Now they had fighters who could handle guns once they seized them. Every day brought new danger. The SS sensed unrest. In mid-October, a worker was caught carrying a piece of wire. He was shot on the spot, and the others were lined up and warned that the next attempt to escape would mean collective death. Pechersky realized time was running out. On October 13th, the underground met for a final council. They set the date of the uprising, October 14th, 1943. There was no turning back. Either we act or we die, Pechersky said. The next 2 days were filled with silent preparations. Axes were sharpened, knives hidden, signals arranged. Workshops were chosen, the shoemakers, the carpenters, the clothing depot, each a future execution site. Every man knew his role. Who would strike, who would seize the weapon, who would run to the gates to open the way. Pechersky slept little, reviewing every step again and again. A single failure could doom them all. But hesitation was worse. If they did not act, the Germans would soon kill them anyway. Better to die fighting than on our knees, he said that night as silence fell over the camp before the storm. October 14th would be the day when, for the first time in the history of death camps, prisoners took their fate into their own hands. Preparations were complete, decisions made, and there was no way back. The forests around Sobibor did not yet know that within hours they would echo with gunfire and the cries of men running toward freedom. The day that changed Sobibor. October 14th, 1943, began like any other day in the death camp. The gates of Sobibor opened. Prisoners were lined up for roll call and assigned to their usual tasks. No one outside the secret group knew that this would be the day to change history. The morning passed with the same routine. Hard labor, shouts, blows, humiliation. But inside the conspirators, a quiet fire burned. Alexander Pechersky and Leon Feldhendler exchanged a brief glance. Today, it was freedom or death. The first phase of the plan began after noon. SS men were summoned to workshops one by one under ordinary pretexts. One came to try on boots, another to collect a new coat, a third to inspect confiscated valuables. Once inside, they never came out. Axes and knives did their silent work behind closed doors. Each killing was executed with surgical precision. Pechersky himself took part in several, knowing that each weapon seized meant another step toward freedom. By 4 o'clock, the underground had eliminated 11 of the 20 SS officers and several Ukrainian guards. Their rifles were hidden in advance under planks and in barrels. The plan called for all officers to be killed quietly before the general alarm. Then the prisoners would assemble near the gate, pretending to be on work duty, and rush the exit at the signal. But fate interfered. Around 4:31 of the Germans noticed the absence of his comrades and raised the alarm. Gunfire erupted, shouts echoed, chaos broke loose. There was no more time for stealth. Prisoners grabbed the hidden rifles, axes, and stones and charged toward the main gate. Machine guns rattled from the towers, cutting people down in waves. Bodies fell, but the mass kept moving forward. Some leapt over the barbed wire, others tore it apart with their hands, bleeding but unstoppable. Pechersky shouted, "Follow me to the forest." His voice pierced the roar of gunfire. The crowd surged after him, breaking through fences and sprinting across the minefields. Explosions lit the darkening sky. Dozens were blown apart, yet hundreds kept running. By sheer will, many reached the woods, where temporary safety awaited. Behind them, Sobibor burned. The camp courtyard was strewn with bodies, both prisoners and guards. Of roughly 600 people held in Sobibor that day, about 300 escaped the wire. The rest died in the gunfire or on the mines. But the impossible had happened. For the first time in history, prisoners of a Nazi death camp rose up, killed their captors, and broke free. Within weeks, the Germans erased the camp from existence. They dismantled every building, leveled the ground, mined the site, and planted trees to hide the evidence. Pechersky and his companions fled through the swamps and forests, hunted by German patrols and dogs. They split into small groups to increase their chances. Many were caught and executed, but dozens reached partisan units and took up arms again against the Nazis. October 14th became a day of defiance. The day when those condemned to die proved that even in hell, human dignity can rise. Alexander Pechersky became a symbol of courage, the man who defied the most murderous system of the 20th century. Partisan warfare and the search for survivors. The forests of Belarus greeted the fugitives from Sobibor with grim silence. On October 14th, 1943, they had broken free from the gates of death. But freedom brought only a new struggle. Hunger, cold, and the constant pursuit by German troops turned every hour into a fight for life. Alexander Pechersky knew that unless they reached the Partisans soon, none would survive. The escapees split into small groups to confuse the search parties. The Nazis sent soldiers, dogs, and local collaborators to hunt them down. Every bark, every shot in the night meant death was near. Some collapsed in the swamps, frozen and exhausted. Others fell into ambushes and fought to the end. Pechersky led a group of 12 men northeast toward the supposed partisan zone. They slept in pits, drank from puddles, and ate roots. On the third day, they reached the River Bug. There were no boats. They built a raft of logs. During the crossing, a German patrol spotted them, but they managed to hide among the reeds, losing 2 of their comrades in the process. On the 4th night, they stumbled upon the partisan detachment named after Stores. At first, the partisans mistook them for spies. Only when Pechersky showed his tattered Red Army officer's ID did they believe him. They were fed, clothed, and, for the first time in weeks, felt human again. Rest did not last long. Within 2 days, Pechersky joined the partisans on raids. He knew the fight was not over as long as the camp still functioned. Using his military experience, he formed a small sabotage team. One of their first missions was to blow up a train carrying ammunition on the Brest-Minsk line. On the night of October 22nd, they set explosives under the rails. The train derailed, and dozens of German soldiers were killed. For Pechersky, it was retribution for those who had perished in the gas chambers of Sobibor. In November 1943, he sought contact with other partisan units to report the uprising as an act of resistance, not mere escape. He begged for help to find those still hiding in the forests. A few groups were rescued and joined the Partisans. Many others were never found, victims of frost or German reprisals. Through the winter of 1943 to 1944, the Partisan War intensified. Pechersky took part in attacks on garrisons, destruction of bridges, and raids on warehouses. The Germans listed him in their reports as a dangerous criminal, but they never caught him. When in July 1944, the Red Army launched Operation Bagration, the forests erupted with the thunder of liberation. Former Sobibor prisoners emerged from hiding to meet the advancing troops. Pechersky was among them, alive, hardened, and forever changed. He returned not only as an officer, but as a man who had defied the impossible. Yet the weight of loss never left him. Of the roughly 600 who escaped that day, only about 50 survived the war. Pechersky made it his life's duty to tell their story, to ensure the voices of the dead were never silenced. Return to civilian life and the fight for memory. The summer of 1944 brought long-awaited liberation to the western lands of the Soviet Union. After months of partisan warfare, Alexander Pechersky finally left the forests and rejoined the Red Army. His face was gaunt, his eyes carried the shadows of Sobibor, yet his heart burned with one goal: to end the war and bring justice for the dead. In July, he reported to the front headquarters and gave a detailed account of the revolt in the death camp. Among the stern officers, his story sounded almost unbelievable. A revolt inside a Nazi extermination camp. But there was little time for reflection. By August, Pechersky was again in combat, commanding an assault platoon during the battles for Poland. He fought fiercely, as if every bullet were aimed at the memory of Sobibor. Victory Day in May 1945 found him in East Prussia. He was wounded, but alive. While others celebrated, Pechersky stood silent, seeing in his mind the faces of those who had never left the camp. He swore that their story would not vanish into silence. After demobilization in 1946, he returned to Rostov-on-Don. Peace felt alien. The city lay in ruins, and he had to think of survival, work, food, a roof. Yet his true mission was to tell the world about Sobibor. He began writing his memoirs, describing the uprising in detail. But publication in Soviet newspapers was impossible. The Holocaust was not a welcome subject, and stories of Jewish prisoners did not fit the official heroic narrative. Officials advised him not to stir up the past. In 1947, Pechersky testified at the Nuremberg Trials. Standing before the court of the Nazi leaders, he spoke of gas chambers, shootings, and systematic murder. His testimony became part of the evidence against the perpetrators. But even there, he felt the full truth was not being heard. In the following years, he sent letters to ministries, editors, and historians, demanding that the memory of Sobibor be preserved. He called for monuments to be erected, for the story of the revolt to be known to future generations. The official response remained cold. Archives stayed sealed, and censored publications reduced his role to a footnote. Only in the late 1950s did the first essays about the uprising appear. They mentioned his name briefly, but softened the facts. Still, Pechersky persisted, fighting Oblivion with the same stubbornness with which he had once fought death. For the few survivors of Sobibor, he became a unifying figure. He searched for them, wrote letters, helped restore their biographies. Each life saved from Oblivion was a small victory against the Nazis and against time. His post-war years were far from easy. He worked at factories, later in the theater, but always remained the man from the camp, marked and often mistrusted. Yet to his last day, Pechersky considered his greatest duty to defend memory, to ensure that the courage of Sobibor would never disappear into silence. Later years, recognition and oblivion. The years passed. Time carried away the fire of war, the horror of the death camps, and even the memory of the uprising at Sobibor. But for Alexander Pechersky, the past never faded. It lived in his nightmares, in letters to officials, in conversations with students. He could not stop reliving it, not while truth remained half-buried. Through the 1950s and 1960s, he continued his lonely battle for recognition. Official Soviet history all but ignored the revolt. The heroism of Jewish prisoners did not fit the state's vision of the war, where glory belonged to armies and generals. Bureaucrats dismissed his letters, calling his persistence excessive. Only in 1965, on the 20th anniversary of victory, did something change. For the first time, he was invited to Moscow for celebrations. On that stage, his name was publicly mentioned as the organizer of the largest death camp revolt of the Second World War. But the recognition was fleeting, a flash of light in a long night of silence. By the late 1960s, Pechersky began corresponding with foreign historians studying the Holocaust. He provided detailed testimonies and helped identify the names of the murdered. His words appeared in books and documentaries abroad. Outside the Soviet Union, his name was becoming a symbol of resistance against genocide. At home, the struggle went on. Authorities no longer forbade his speeches, but neither did they help. School textbooks ignored Sobibor, and documentaries were censored or postponed. The memory of the revolt survived only through his stubborn will. In 1972, a Polish film titled Escape from Sobibor was released, based partly on his memoirs. The film reached audiences across the world, moving millions. In the Soviet Union, it was shown only in a few clubs and cultural centers. Once again, Pechersky realized that truth demanded the same courage as war. Only in the 1980s, with the coming of perestroika, did the silence begin to break. In 1987, Moscow hosted the first official conference devoted to uprisings in death camps. Pechersky, already an old man, was the main speaker. His voice trembled as he said, "We rose so the world would know the truth. Let it never be forgotten again." Recognition came late and incomplete. Despite petitions from survivors and historians, Pechersky never received high state honors. To many officials, his story remained inconvenient, a reminder of things the country preferred to forget. Alexander Pechersky died on January 2, 1990, at the age of 79. He never lived to see full justice for his comrades or his own name honored as it deserved. He was buried in Rostov-on-Don beside others who shared the fate of war. Only decades later, in the early 21st century, did his name officially become a symbol of defiance and courage. Monuments, books, and films finally told the story he had carried alone for half a lifetime. His final years were a battle not with death, but with forgetfulness. And in that fight, too, he prevailed, leaving behind not bitterness, but a legacy of truth that no regime could erase. The legacy of Alexander Pechersky, a deed that could not be erased. Decades passed after the end of the Second World War. The names of many heroes faded into the dust of time. Deeds once spoken of with reverence were reduced to a few lines in textbooks. Yet the story of Alexander Pechersky became the exception, the one memory that neither politics nor time could erase. After his death on January 2, 1990, there was another long silence. The Soviet Union entered a new era, but the memory of the uprising still lay hidden beneath bureaucratic indifference. Abroad, however, Pechersky's name grew louder each year. Historians and filmmakers saw in his story proof that even in the very heart of evil, the human spirit could resist. In the early 2000s, Poland, the Netherlands, Israel, and the United States began building memorials dedicated to the Sobibor Revolt. In each of them, the name of Alexander Pechersky stood at the center, the man who turned despair into defiance. In 2008, the Netherlands hosted the first major international exhibition about the uprising. Its centerpiece was Pechersky's personal archive: letters, photographs, and documents from both the camp and the Partisans. It was only in 2012 that Russia founded the Alexander Pechersky Memorial Foundation, dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of Sobibor. For the first time, official gratitude was expressed to the man who had saved hundreds of lives and shown the world what courage truly meant. In 2018, the feature film Sobibor premiered, starring Konstantin Kabensky as Pechersky. The film gained international attention, reminding millions that even among the countless victims of the Holocaust, there were those who fought back and won. Today, streets in Rostov-on-Don and in Israel bear his name. Museums in Europe and America include him among the symbols of resistance. In 2020, the first international forum dedicated to the Sobibor uprising was held, proclaiming Pechersky a symbol of unbroken will and human dignity. Even so, the struggle for full recognition continues. Historians and relatives have campaigned to grant him the title of Hero of Russia, the highest national honor he was denied in life. Despite repeated petitions, the award remains ungranted. Yet his greatest monument stands not in stone or metal, but in memory. Every retelling of the Sobibor Revolt, every lesson, every film or book about the camp, all of them continue his fight against oblivion. Historians now call the Sobibor breakout the only fully successful uprising in a Nazi death camp. It was led by a man with no army, no weapons, and no hope of survival. Only willpower and faith that freedom was worth any price. Alexander Pechersky left the world a lesson. Even in the darkest place, courage can burn brighter than fear. His life proves that a single act of defiance can shatter the walls built by an empire of death. And no matter how much time passes, his deed cannot be erased. The final words. This is not just the story of one man. It is a chronicle of defiance, a reminder that even when humanity stands on the edge of annihilation, one willful heart can fight back. Alexander Pechersky's name was meant to vanish. The Nazis tried to erase it with fire and ash. The Soviet bureaucracy tried to drown it in silence. But truth cannot be buried forever. It finds its way through the cracks of time. In our investigation, we have gathered documents, forgotten testimonies, rare footage, and the voices of those who once stood beside him. Step by step, we have retraced the journey of the man who led the largest escape from a Nazi death camp, and proved that freedom can be born even in the shadow of death. The story of Alexander Pechersky is the story of a strength greater than any weapon. He had no army, no power, no certainty of survival. He had only will, and the belief that to live as a human being, one must never bow to evil. Today, decades later, we speak his name aloud, so it will never again fall into silence. The uprising of Sobibor stands as a monument not only to the dead, but to the living spirit that refused to break. If you want stories like this to be heard, if you believe that memory must be kept alive, support this channel. Subscribe, like, and share. Let the memory of real heroes live not only in books and archives, but in the hearts of millions.